The eviction notice taped to my cabin door had fancy letterhead and a 24-hour deadline, but what caught my attention was the signature of someone claiming authority over land my family had owned since 1952. Standing there in my work boots and flannel shirt, holding papers that threatened to destroy my grandfather's legacy, I couldn't help but smile. These people had no idea they'd just picked a fight with the wrong property owner or that their entire subdivision was built on land they didn't actually control. My name is Blake Morrison, and until 6 months ago, I was a real estate attorney specializing in property disputes and land development law for 32 years. I'd handled everything from eminent domain cases to boundary disputes, but when my wife Sarah passed from cancer last year, I decided I'd had enough of courtrooms and corporate conference rooms. I took early retirement and moved to my grandfather's old fishing cabin in the North Carolina mountains, a place where 3 generations of Morrison men had found peace among the pine trees and rushing streams. The cabin sat on 47 acres of pristine wilderness that had been in our family since my grandfather bought it, from a struggling farmer after World War II, complete with mineral rights and water access that made it one of the most valuable properties in the county. The cabin itself was nothing fancy, a 2-bedroom log structure with a stone fireplace that my grandfather had built with his own hands, expanded by my father in the 1980s, and maintained by me during weekend visits throughout my legal career. What made it special wasn't the rustic architecture or the scenic views, but the sense of continuity it represented, connecting me to men who'd valued hard work, family legacy, and the kind of self-reliance that seems increasingly rare in our modern world. I'd planned to spend my remaining years here reading legal thrillers, practicing catch and release fishing, and maybe writing the novel I'd always promised myself I'd tackle someday when I finally had time to think about something other than property law and client deadlines. That peaceful retirement plan lasted exactly 6 months before Jessica Hawthorne moved to Whispering Pines, the upscale development that had been built 2 miles down the mountain from my cabin in 2019. Jessica was 34, recently divorced, and apparently determined to make up for whatever authority she'd lost in her personal life by exercising maximum control over her new neighborhood environment. She'd moved from Charlotte with her 12-year-old daughter Emma, buying a 4-bedroom house that cost 3 times what most locals made in a year, and immediately set about transforming the casual mountain community into her vision of suburban perfection. Within 3 months of her arrival, Jessica had gotten herself elected president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, promising to address what she called declining community standards and inadequate protection of property values. She wore expensive business suits to HOA meetings in a community where most residents dressed for hiking and fishing, carried a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and spoke about residential zoning and community aesthetics, like she was delivering a corporate presentation rather than discussing neighbor disputes about fence heights and dog walking policies. The first sign of trouble came when Jessica started organizing what she called community compliance surveys, driving around the area in her white BMW, documenting what she termed non-conforming land uses and potential environmental hazards. My neighbor Bill Henderson, a retired forest ranger who lived about a mile down the mountain, warned me that Jessica had been asking questions about my cabin, specifically whether it met current building codes and environmental regulations for the watershed area where we lived. "She's been taking pictures of your place from the road," Bill told me during one of our weekly coffee visits at Murphy's General Store. Measured distances, wrote things down in that fancy notebook of hers, asked me if I knew whether you had proper permits for your septic system and whether your cabin was affecting water runoff into the creek. Told her your family's been here since before there were permits for anything, but she just smiled that plastic smile and said times change and everyone needs to follow current regulations. I dealt with enough ambitious people during my legal career to recognize the type Jessica represented, but I made the mistake of assuming she was just another suburban busybody who'd eventually run out of energy for manufactured drama. I figured the worst she could do was file complaints with county officials who would quickly explain to her that grandfather clause protections and established property rights weren't subject to the whims of homeowners associations that had been created decades after the fact. 2 weeks later, I found the first official notice tucked under my windshield wiper when I returned from a morning fishing trip. The document was printed on Whispering Pines HOA letterhead and signed by Jessica Hawthorne, Community Standards Compliance Officer, demanding that I appear at a hearing to address multiple violations of community development standards. According to the notice, my cabin constituted a non-conforming structure that degraded the aesthetic character of the watershed area and posed potential environmental risks to downstream residential properties. The violations were impressively creative: unauthorized permanent structure in sensitive environmental zone, non-compliant waste management system affecting community water resources, excessive vegetation maintenance creating fire hazard risks, and unauthorized recreational vehicle parking, referring to my 12-year-old pickup truck that I parked next to the cabin. Each violation carried fines ranging from $500 to $2,000, with additional penalties for continued non-compliance after notification. What made the whole thing particularly absurd was the legal language Jessica had copied from various county and state websites, creating an impressive-looking document that would fool anyone who didn't understand the actual regulatory framework governing mountain properties. She'd obviously spent considerable time researching environmental regulations and building codes, then selectively quoted sections that seemed to support her position while ignoring the grandfather clause protections and property rights that made her claims legally meaningless. I called Bill Henderson that evening to ask if he'd received any similar notices, and his laughter was audible across the phone line. "Blake, that woman couldn't regulate my doghouse if she tried. Your cabin's been there since before she was born, and it's on private land that's not subject to any HOA authority. She might as well be trying to fine the trees for growing too tall or the creek for running too loud." But Jessica's harassment campaign was just beginning, and over the following weeks, it became clear that she'd organized a systematic effort to document everything about my property that could potentially be construed as a violation of something. She'd recruited several Whispering Pines residents to participate in what she called environmental monitoring activities, essentially training them to photograph and measure various aspects of my land use and report back to her with their findings. The volunteers included Margaret Fuller, a retired school administrator who seemed to enjoy the authority that came with carrying an official clipboard, David Chen, an accountant who treated the measuring and documenting like a precision engineering project, and Susan Walsh, a recent retiree who'd apparently found purpose in Jessica's crusade against non-conforming land uses. Together, they conducted weekly surveys of my property from public road access points, photographing everything from my woodpile to my outdoor furniture arrangement, and creating detailed reports about activities they witnessed during their surveillance operations. Margaret Fuller approached me at the post office one afternoon, introducing herself as the Whispering Pines Environmental Compliance Coordinator and explaining that community residents were concerned about potential impacts from my residential activities. She wore a official-looking badge that Jessica had apparently created for the volunteer monitoring program and spoke with the kind of earnest authority that suggested she genuinely believed she was protecting the environment from my dangerous cabin. "Mr. Morrison," she said, consulting her clipboard with theatrical precision, "we've documented several concerning patterns in your land use that may require intervention from appropriate regulatory authorities. Your wood-burning activities are producing excessive particulate emissions during community quiet hours. Your vehicle maintenance practices are potentially contaminating soil near the creek, and your failure to maintain defensible space around your structure is creating fire risks for downstream properties." I listened to her recitation of imaginary violations while trying to process the absurdity of being lectured about land management by someone who'd moved to the mountains 18 months ago and apparently thought that burning firewood in a wood stove during winter was some kind of environmental crime. Margaret's earnest concern might have been touching if it hadn't been so obviously manufactured by Jessica's campaign to create problems where none existed. "Ma'am," I replied, keeping my voice polite despite my growing irritation. "I appreciate your concern, but this property has been managed by my family for over 70 years, without any complaints from neighbors or regulatory agencies. The wood stove meets all applicable codes. The vehicle maintenance consists of changing oil in my own driveway, and the fire clearing around my cabin exceeds county recommendations for defensible space." Margaret made notes on her clipboard with the dedication of someone conducting a federal investigation, then handed me a card with Jessica's contact information and a request that I coordinate with community leadership to address resident concerns through proper channels. The whole interaction felt like an elaborate performance designed to create the impression that legitimate authority was involved in what was obviously a neighbor dispute manufactured by someone with too much time and too little understanding of property rights. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since retiring from legal practice. I opened my laptop and started researching the regulatory and legal framework governing Jessica's claims. What I discovered confirmed my suspicions that her entire campaign was based on selective misinterpretation of laws and regulations that didn't apply to my property or situation. The Whispering Pines development had been built on land that was subject to certain environmental restrictions and community standards because the developers had received tax incentives and regulatory relief in exchange for agreeing to maintain specific development patterns and environmental protections. Those restrictions applied only to properties within the development boundaries and had no authority over existing private land that had never been part of the development project. More importantly, my cabin and the surrounding acreage were protected by multiple layers of grandfather clause provisions dating back to the original county zoning ordinances from the 1960s. As long as the land use remained substantially similar to historical patterns, which it had, no regulatory authority could force changes to my property management or require compliance with regulations that had been created after my family's land use was established. Jessica's volunteer monitoring program was essentially harassment disguised as environmental protection, and her claims about community authority over my property rights were legally meaningless. But what concerned me more than her ignorance of property law was the systematic nature of her campaign and the number of people she'd convinced to participate in surveillance and documentation activities that seemed designed to build some kind of case against me. The harassment escalated significantly when Jessica sent me the formal violation notice that would change everything about our relationship. The document arrived via certified mail on official-looking letterhead identifying her as president, Whispering Pines Community Standards Authority, and demanding my appearance at a compliance hearing to address violations that threatened community safety and environmental integrity. According to the notice, my cabin was in violation of current residential building codes, watershed protection regulations, and community aesthetic standards, and I had 30 days to either bring the property into compliance or face legal action to enforce community standards. The violations had been upgraded from her original complaints to include structural deficiencies requiring professional inspection, environmental contamination, requiring soil and water testing, and fire hazards requiring immediate remediation or removal of the structure. Jessica had obviously done additional research since her first attempt at legal intimidation, because this notice included citations to actual state and county regulations, though she'd continued her pattern of selective quotation and misapplication of laws that didn't apply to my situation. She'd also added a new element that revealed the true scope of her ambitions, a requirement that I coordinate with community planners to develop a property management plan that would ensure compatibility with neighborhood standards and long-term development goals. The document concluded with language that made my blood pressure spike. Failure to achieve compliance within the specified time frame will result in legal action to protect community interests, including but not limited to injunctive relief, requiring cessation of non-conforming land uses and restoration of the property to community-compatible condition. In plain English, Jessica was threatening to take me to court to force me to tear down my family's cabin and restore the land to whatever she considered appropriate for her vision of community development. The woman who'd moved to the mountains 2 years ago was demanding that I destroy a structure my grandfather had built with his own hands 70 years earlier, based on her interpretation of regulations that had no authority over my property rights. That's when I made a decision that would determine how this entire conflict would be resolved. Instead of responding to Jessica's threats with anger or defensive arguments about my property rights, I would approach this situation like the real estate attorney I'd been for over 3 decades. I would research every aspect of the legal and regulatory framework, document every detail of Jessica's harassment campaign, and prepare a response that would end her manufactured crisis permanently. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse and spent 6 hours in the property records office, researching the complete legal history of my land and the Whispering Pines development. What I discovered was far more interesting than I'd expected, and it provided exactly the leverage I needed to resolve Jessica's harassment once and for all. The records showed that when the Whispering Pines development was approved in 2018, the developers had been required to purchase easement rights for road access and utilities from surrounding landowners, including my family. My father had signed an agreement allowing the development to run their main access road across a corner of our property in exchange for annual easement payments that were supposed to continue as long as the road was in use. More importantly, the utility easements for water, sewer, and electrical service to the entire Whispering Pines development ran across my land under agreements that my father had signed with specific terms about maintenance responsibilities and access restrictions. The developers had needed these easements because the mountain terrain made it impossible to provide utilities to the development without crossing private land that my family controlled. According to the original agreements, which I found filed with the county but apparently never reviewed by Jessica during her research, my family retained the right to modify or terminate the easement arrangements if the development or its residents interfered with our property rights or violated the terms of the original access agreements. The easement payments had been automatically deposited into my father's bank account for years, and after his death, they'd been transferred to an account I rarely monitored because the amounts were relatively small compared to my attorney income. But the most important discovery was a clause in the utility easement agreement that I'd never noticed before because it had seemed irrelevant during my working years. If disputes arose between the development and the easement grantor regarding property rights or land use conflicts, the grantor had the authority to require renegotiation of all easement terms, including access fees and usage restrictions. Jessica's harassment campaign and threats to my property rights constituted exactly the kind of interference that would trigger my right to renegotiate the easement agreements. And since the entire Whispering Pines development depended on utilities and road access that crossed my land, I suddenly had considerably more leverage in this dispute than anyone realized. That afternoon, I called Jim Washburn, a civil engineer who specialized in utility planning and had handled several similar disputes involving development easements and property rights. After reviewing the original agreements and the current situation, Jim confirmed that my legal position was extremely strong and that Jessica's threats to my property had inadvertently triggered a renegotiation opportunity that could be very expensive for the Whispering Pines community. "Blake," Jim explained, "these easement agreements were negotiated 25 years ago when land values and utility costs were a fraction of current market rates. If you exercise your right to renegotiate based on the harassment you've documented, you could legitimately increase the annual fees to reflect current market value for this kind of access. We're probably talking about a 10-fold increase in what they're currently paying, minimum." The next phase of my research involved consulting with environmental lawyers and property rights specialists to ensure that my response to Jessica's threats would be legally bulletproof and professionally devastating to her in a manufactured case. What I learned convinced me that Jessica had not only failed to understand the law, but had actually committed several violations of her own that could result in criminal charges if I chose to pursue them. By filing false complaints with county agencies, making legal threats based on non-existent authority, and organizing surveillance of my property without legitimate justification, Jessica had crossed the line from annoying neighbor to potential criminal, Her volunteer monitoring program could be construed as stalking or harassment. Her false claims about regulatory violations constituted fraud, and her threats to force destruction of my property might qualify as extortion under North Carolina law. But rather than pursuing criminal charges, I decided to use Jessica's own tactics against her by organizing a community response that would expose her manufactured crisis while protecting other residents from similar harassment. I started by contacting every property owner in the surrounding area to warn them about Jessica's methods and to gather information about whether she'd targeted anyone else with her compliance campaigns. What I discovered was a pattern of harassment that extended well beyond my property. Jessica had sent violation notices to 6 other landowners in the area, all people whose properties didn't conform to her vision of appropriate mountain development. Sam Rodriguez had been cited for operating an automotive repair business from his home shop, even though he'd been running the business legally for 15 years. Martha Bell had received complaints about her horse pasture, with claims that the animals were creating odor and noise problems for nearby residents who'd moved next to her farm voluntarily. Most disturbing was Jessica's campaign against Franklin Waters, an 82-year-old veteran who lived in a small trailer on land he'd owned since the 1970s. Jessica had filed complaints with the county claiming that Franklin's property was a health hazard and demanding that he be forced to connect to community sewer systems that would cost him more than his annual Social Security income. The harassment had caused Franklin so much stress that his daughter was considering moving him to assisted living rather than continuing to fight Jessica's legal threats. Armed with evidence of a systematic harassment campaign affecting multiple property owners, I began organizing a legal response that would end Jessica's authority campaign permanently while protecting other residents from her manufactured compliance crisis. The strategy I developed would use her own tactics against her while exposing the complete lack of legal foundation for her claims about community authority over private property rights. 3 weeks after receiving Jessica's ultimatum about my cabin, I was ready to deliver my response. But instead of mailing her a letter or requesting a meeting, I decided to address her threats in the most public way possible. At the next Whispering Pines HOA meeting, where she'd planned to present her case against my property to the community and request their support for legal action against multiple area landowners. The HOA meeting was held in the community center at Whispering Pines, a modern building with conference facilities that Jessica had reserved for what she'd advertised as a critical community safety presentation about non-conforming land uses, threatening property values, and environmental integrity. About 40 residents attended, which was the largest turnout in the development's history, drawn by Jessica's dramatic announcements about regulatory violations and potential legal action to protect community interests. Jessica had prepared an elaborate presentation complete with aerial photographs of surrounding properties, charts showing property value trends, and copies of the violation notices she'd sent to various landowners. She wore a navy blue business suit that made her look like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments, and she'd arranged the meeting room like a formal hearing with herself, positioned at the head table and residents seated in rows facing her presentation area. I arrived 15 minutes before the meeting started, dressed in the khaki pants and button-down shirt that had been my standard courtroom attire for 30 years. I carried a leather briefcase containing copies of all the property documents, easement agreements, and legal research I'd compiled over the previous weeks. Most importantly, I brought a letter from my new attorney, Patricia Reynolds, one of the state's leading experts in property rights law, who'd agreed to represent me in any legal action resulting from Jessica's harassment campaign. When Jessica called the meeting to order and began her presentation about community safety threats and property value protection, I listened quietly while she displayed photographs of my cabin and described it as a non-conforming structure that posed environmental risks and aesthetic degradation to the surrounding area. She'd obviously spent considerable time preparing her case, creating charts and graphs that made her arguments look professionally researched and scientifically supported. Ladies and gentlemen, Jessica announced with the authority of someone addressing a corporate board meeting, We're facing a crisis that threatens everything we've invested in this community. Non-conforming land uses and unauthorized structures are undermining our property values and exposing us to environmental liabilities that could cost every homeowner thousands of dollars in remediation expenses. She continued her presentation for 20 minutes, describing various properties in the area as threats to community integrity and requesting resident support for legal action to enforce what she called necessary compliance with current development standards. The audience seemed impressed by her professional presentation and concerned by her warnings about property values and environmental risks. When Jessica concluded her presentation and asked for questions, I stood up and introduced myself to the residents who didn't know me. Good evening. I'm Blake Morrison, and I own the cabin that Mrs. Hawthorne has been discussing. I'd like to address some of the claims she's made about my property and the legal authority she's claiming to enforce compliance with community standards. The room fell silent as I walked to the front and opened my briefcase, pulling out copies of the easement agreements and property documents that would change everyone's understanding of the situation. Mrs. Hawthorne has made several claims about community authority and property compliance that I need to correct. First, my cabin is protected by grandfather clause provisions that predate any development standards by decades. Second, there is no legal authority for HOA enforcement of compliance on private property outside your development boundaries. I distributed copies of the relevant legal documents to interested residents while continuing my explanation. But most importantly, Mrs. Hawthorne's harassment campaign has triggered my right to renegotiate the easement agreements that provide road access and utilities to this entire development. Every home in Whispering Pines depends on infrastructure that crosses my family's land under agreements that can be modified when residents interfere with our property rights. The change in atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Residents who had been nodding along with Jessica's presentation suddenly looked concerned about the implications of what I was explaining. Jessica's confident authority was replaced by visible panic as she realized that her legal threats had consequences she hadn't anticipated. Furthermore, I continued, I've consulted with environmental lawyers and property rights specialists who've confirmed that Mrs. Hawthorne's claims about regulatory violations are based on misapplication of laws that don't apply to my property. Her volunteer monitoring program constitutes harassment, her violation notices are fraudulent, and her threats to force destruction of my cabin may qualify as extortion under state law. Margaret Fuller, David Chen, and Susan Walsh, the volunteers who'd been participating in Jessica's monitoring program, looked increasingly uncomfortable as I explained the legal problems with their surveillance activities. Several other residents began asking pointed questions about Jessica's authority to speak for the community and whether the HOA board had actually authorized her compliance enforcement campaign. The final blow to Jessica's presentation came when I revealed the financial implications of her harassment campaign. According to the easement agreements you're all dependent on, Mrs. Hawthorne's interference with my property rights gives me the authority to renegotiate all access fees and usage terms. The current annual easement payments total about $8,000 for the entire development. Fair market value for this level of access and utility service would be approximately $80,000 annually, which would add about $1,700 to each household's annual HOA fees. The silence that followed was deafening. 40 families who'd thought they were supporting a reasonable community compliance program suddenly realized they were facing massive fee increases because of Jessica's manufactured legal crisis. The woman who'd promised to protect their property values had potentially created a financial disaster that would cost every household thousands of dollars annually. Jessica tried to regain control of the meeting by claiming that my documents were somehow fraudulent or that I was misrepresenting the legal situation, but several residents demanded to see the easement agreements and property records for themselves. When Margaret Fuller asked to examine the monitoring program documentation she'd been collecting, she discovered that none of Jessica's claims about regulatory authority were supported by actual law or county policy. The meeting that was supposed to rally community support for Jessica's enforcement campaign instead turned into a revolt against her manufactured authority. Residents demanded her immediate resignation from any leadership role, requested a complete audit of her compliance activities, and voted to formally apologize to me and the other property owners who'd been subjected to her harassment campaign. David Chen, who'd been one of Jessica's most dedicated volunteers, publicly apologized for participating in surveillance activities and asked me what he could do to help resolve the situation created by Jessica's legal threats. Susan Walsh admitted that she'd been uncomfortable with the monitoring program from the beginning, but had been convinced by Jessica's claims about environmental protection and community safety. 2 days after the HOA meeting, I received a hand-delivered letter from Jessica offering to withdraw all compliance complaints and cease any further monitoring of my property if I would agree not to renegotiate the easement agreements. The letter was obviously written by her lawyer and included an apology for any misunderstanding about community authority and regulatory requirements. But Jessica's offer was too little, too late. Her systematic harassment of multiple property owners had created a legal situation that required formal resolution, and her threats to destroy my family's cabin had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed with a simple apology. I had already filed complaints with the county attorney's office about her fraudulent violation notices and false claims about regulatory authority, triggering an investigation that would determine whether criminal charges were appropriate. More importantly, I had decided to exercise my right to renegotiate the easement agreements regardless of Jessica's belated attempt to apologize. Her harassment campaign had demonstrated that the current arrangements provided insufficient protection for my property rights, and the financial terms needed to be updated to reflect both current market values and the costs associated with dealing with hostile neighbors who didn't understand legal boundaries. The renegotiation process took 3 months and resulted in a complete restructuring of the relationship between my property and the Whispering Pines development. The new easement agreements increased annual access fees from $8,000 to $75,000, added specific language prohibiting harassment of the grantor or interference with property rights, and included provisions for immediate termination of access privileges if residents violated the terms of the agreement. The fee increase was distributed among all Whispering Pines households as a special assessment of approximately $1,600 annually, a financial reminder that community activism has consequences when it targets property owners who actually understand legal rights and have the resources to enforce them. The assessment was structured as a permanent addition to HOA dues, ensuring that every resident would remember the cost of Jessica's manufactured crisis for as long as they lived in the development. Jessica herself faced more serious consequences than just financial liability for her role in creating the crisis. The county attorney's investigation resulted in criminal charges for filing false reports and making fraudulent claims about government authority. She was required to pay restitution to all the property owners she'd harassed, complete community service hours focused on property rights, education, and accept a permanent restraining order prohibiting her from any further compliance monitoring or enforcement activities. Most satisfying was the requirement that Jessica personally apologize to each property owner she'd targeted, including Franklin Waters, who'd been so stressed by her harassment that his health had deteriorated significantly. Her apology letter to me was read aloud at a community meeting, ensuring that everyone understood the consequences of her manufactured authority and fraudulent legal claims. The financial impact on Jessica was devastating enough to force her to sell her house and move away from the area entirely. The legal fees, restitution payments, and loss of property value from her criminal conviction made it impossible for her to maintain her mortgage payments, and the special assessment she'd created through her harassment campaign made her property virtually unsellable to potential buyers who didn't want to inherit the ongoing easement obligations. 6 months after Jessica's departure, Whispering Pines had become a much more peaceful community. The new HOA leadership focused on legitimate community issues like road maintenance and snow removal, rather than manufactured compliance, crises, and property rights enforcement. Residents had learned an expensive lesson about the difference between actual authority and suburban activism, and the special assessment served as a permanent reminder that harassment campaigns have financial consequences. My own situation had improved dramatically beyond just the resolution of Jessica's threats. The increased easement payments provided substantial additional income that I used to make improvements to my cabin and the surrounding land, including better road access and upgraded utilities that benefited both my property and the development. More importantly, the legal precedent established by the case attracted attention from property rights organizations throughout North Carolina, leading to speaking opportunities and consulting work that gave my retirement years new purpose and meaning. The cabin that Jessica had threatened to destroy became the center of a thriving property rights education program that I established to help rural landowners understand their legal protections against suburban encroachment and HOA overreach. The program attracted participants from throughout the region, generating additional income while serving a community need that I'd never realized existed during my urban legal practice. Franklin Waters, who'd been Jessica's most vulnerable target, became one of my closest friends and a regular visitor to the cabin. His daughter decided against moving him to assisted living after the harassment ended, and he spent his remaining years enjoying the mountain property he'd loved for over 50 years. When Franklin passed away 2 years later, he left his land to a conservation trust, with provisions ensuring that it would never be subject to development pressure or community compliance campaigns. The final irony was that Jessica's campaign to protect property values in Whispering Pines had exactly the opposite effect she'd intended. The special assessment and legal controversy she'd created made the development less attractive to potential buyers, while the properties she'd tried to eliminate through compliance, enforcement became more valuable as examples of grandfathered land uses that were protected from future development pressure. As I sit on my cabin porch each evening, watching the sunset through trees my grandfather planted and listening to the creek that's run unchanged for decades, I'm reminded that the best response to manufactured authority is often simply enforcing legitimate rights that existed long before the troublemakers arrived. Jessica's 24-hour ultimatum had triggered a response that doubled my income, strengthened my property rights, and eliminated a threat to multiple families who deserved better than harassment disguised as environmental protection. The lesson here isn't complicated. Before you threaten someone's family legacy, make sure you understand who actually owns the ground you're standing on. The transformation of our mountain community over the following 2 years exceeded anything I could have imagined when I first found Jessica's ultimatum taped to my cabin door. What started as a property rights dispute had evolved into something much larger and more meaningful, a demonstration that individual citizens could still prevail against manufactured authority when they understood the law and had the patience to use it properly. The property rights education program I established attracted participants from as far away as Tennessee and Virginia, rural landowners who'd heard about the Whispering Pines case and wanted to understand their own legal protections against suburban encroachment. We held monthly workshops at the cabin covering topics like easement law, grandfather clause protections, and strategies for dealing with HOA overreach. The sessions were informal but comprehensive, combining legal education with practical advice from people who'd successfully defended their property rights against various forms of institutional pressure. Martha Bell, whose horse pasture had been targeted by Jessica's compliance campaign, became one of my most effective co-instructors. Her experience dealing with noise, complaints, and odor allegations from suburban neighbors who'd moved next to her farm provided real-world examples of how agricultural operations could protect themselves through proper documentation and legal preparation. Martha's horses had become something of a tourist attraction for Whispering Pines residents who'd learned to appreciate rural character rather than viewing it as a threat to their property values. Sam Rodriguez's automotive repair business had not only survived Jessica's harassment but had actually expanded as a result of the publicity surrounding the case. Several Whispering Pines residents became regular customers after learning that his 15-year operation was completely legal and that his quality work was far superior to the chain shops in town. Sam's story became a favorite example during our workshops of how manufactured compliance crises often target exactly the kind of small businesses that rural communities depend on for economic vitality. The financial impact of the renegotiated easement agreements had forced some changes in Whispering Pines that ultimately benefited the entire community. The increased costs motivated residents to take more active roles in HOA governance, ensuring that future leadership decisions would be made collectively rather than by ambitious individuals with personal agendas. The new board established strict policies about compliance monitoring and external communications, preventing anyone from repeating Jessica's mistakes about claiming authority they didn't possess. More importantly, the special assessment had attracted a different type of buyer to Whispering Pines when properties came on the market. Instead of urban refugees looking for suburban amenities in a mountain setting, the development began attracting people who genuinely appreciated rural character and understood the value of coexisting peacefully with established agricultural and residential uses. The community meetings that had once been dominated by complaints about livestock odors and equipment noise now focused on practical issues like road maintenance and fire prevention. The legal precedent established by our case had broader implications beyond our immediate community. Property rights attorneys throughout North Carolina began citing the Whispering Pines decision in cases involving HOA overreach and suburban encroachment on rural properties. The case became required reading in several law school property rights courses, and I was invited to speak at State Bar Association meetings about strategies for protecting grandfathered land uses against modern development pressure. My consulting practice, which had started as a retirement hobby, grew into a significant source of both income and personal satisfaction. I worked with landowners facing everything from eminent domain threats to wetlands regulation disputes, applying the same methodical research and preparation techniques that had defeated Jessica's harassment campaign. The combination of legal expertise and real-world experience with property rights conflicts made me particularly effective at helping clients understand both their vulnerabilities and their strengths in disputes with various forms of government and pseudo-government authority. The cabin itself had been transformed by the increased income from the easement renegotiation. I'd upgraded the electrical system, installed a modern septic system that exceeded all environmental standards, and added a workshop building where I could restore the antique woodworking tools my grandfather had left behind. The improvements served both practical and symbolic purposes, demonstrating that traditional land uses could be enhanced and modernized without sacrificing their essential character or legal protections. Franklin Waters' legacy lived on through the conservation trust he'd established, which had become a model for other elderly landowners who wanted to protect their properties from development pressure while ensuring they remained accessible to future generations who valued rural character. The trust sponsored annual scholarships for local students studying natural resource management and property law, creating an educational pipeline that would help protect rural communities from future threats. The most unexpected consequence of our victory was the development of genuine friendships with many Whispering Pines residents who'd initially supported Jessica's campaign. David Chen had become a regular participant in our property rights workshops, using his accounting skills to help other landowners understand the financial implications of various legal strategies. Susan Walsh volunteered her time helping elderly property owners organize their legal documents and family records, ensuring they'd be prepared if they ever faced challenges to their land rights. Even Margaret Fuller, Jessica's most dedicated volunteer, had eventually apologized and asked to join our education program. Her experience as a retired school administrator proved valuable in developing curriculum materials and organizing workshop presentations that made complex legal concepts accessible to people without legal training. Margaret's transformation from compliance enforcer to property rights advocate demonstrated that even well-intentioned people could learn from their mistakes when presented with accurate information about the law. The ripple effects of our case continued to spread throughout the region, inspiring other rural landowners to research their own property rights and prepare for potential challenges from suburban neighbors who might not understand the legal framework governing rural land use. County officials reported a significant increase in requests for property records and easement documentation, suggesting that our example had motivated widespread preparation for property rights disputes. As I completed the final documentation for another successful property rights case last month, I reflected on how much my retirement had differed from the quiet, solitary existence I'd originally planned. Jessica's 24-hour ultimatum had forced me back into legal practice, but in a way that combined my professional skills with protection of the rural values and family legacy that had always been most important to me. Her attempt to destroy my grandfather's cabin had instead created opportunities to help dozens of families protect their own properties and strengthen the rural communities that make our region unique. The greatest satisfaction came from knowing that Jessica's harassment campaign had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the legal protections available to rural landowners throughout North Carolina. Her failure had become a teaching tool that would help future generations understand the importance of researching legal claims before accepting them as legitimate authority, and the value of fighting back against manufactured compliance crises that threaten established property rights and community character.